What if one of the most beloved rock songs ever written wasn't just a song, but a whispered goodbye? What if every lyric, every note, was filled with grief for someone who was still alive, but already lost? Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here is more than a ballad. It is a wound disguised as music, a wound left by genius, madness, fame, and the one band member who slipped through their fingers. This is Behind the Hit, where we peel back the layers of the songs you thought you knew. If you're ready to uncover the sorrow, the mystery, and the quiet desperation behind Pink Floyd's Wish You Were Here, make sure you subscribe. Because once you know the real story, you'll never hear the song the same way again. To understand Wish You Were Here, you need to meet the man it was written for, Syd Barrett. In the mid-1960s, Syd wasn't just Pink Floyd's leader, he was Pink Floyd. He had the charisma, the looks, the creativity. He was the songwriter, the visionary, the one who lit up London's psychedelic scene. While other bands chased pop hits, Syd wrote surreal poetry, experimenting with sounds no one had ever heard. Songs like Arnold Lane and See Emily Play introduced a new kind of rock, strange, whimsical, brilliant. Pink Floyd was his canvas, and he painted with light, distortion, and imagination. Fans and critics alike hailed him as a genius, a true original. But genius often walks hand in hand with fragility. By late 1967, things began to fall apart. The drugs that fueled the psychedelic revolution were also destroying Syd's mind. LSD, once a doorway to creativity, became a trap. He grew unpredictable, erratic, unreachable. On stage, he would strum a single chord for the entire show or not play at all. Sometimes he'd stare into the crowd, frozen, as if trapped in another world. In the studio, he'd bring in half-formed songs that spiraled into chaos. His bandmates never knew which Syd would show up, the playful genius or the silent stranger. Friends recalled his eyes, once bright and mischievous, now distant and vacant. Conversations with him grew confusing, full of strange non-sequiturs. He seemed to be slipping away in real time. The band was torn. They loved him, he was their friend, their leader, the reason they existed. But night after night, show after show, Syd was gone in all but body, and then came the moment that changed everything. In early 1968, the band made a silent decision. They added David Gilmour, Syd's old friend from Cambridge, to cover guitar parts and vocals. At first, they hoped he would support Syd, maybe help him find his footing again, but it didn't work. Syd would miss rehearsals, wander off on tour, or show up completely detached. The tension was unbearable. One night, on the way to a gig, someone in the van asked, "Shall we pick Syd up?" And another replied, "No, let's not." That was it. There was no big confrontation, no farewell. Syd was simply left behind. He drifted away, officially out of the band, unofficially still haunting them. The irony was brutal. As Syd faded, Pink Floyd began to rise. They reinvented themselves without him, moving from whimsical psychedelia to sprawling conceptual works. By 1973, The Dark Side of the Moon made them global superstars. It was a masterpiece, polished, profound, selling millions. But instead of joy, success brought emptiness. The band was fractured internally. Roger Waters was growing darker, more controlling. David Gilmour was carrying the weight of Syd's ghost. Richard Wright and Nick Mason often felt sidelined. They were famous, yes, but they were also numb, surrounded by money, contracts, and expectations, yet feeling less like a band and more like cogs in a machine. And in that emptiness, they kept thinking of Syd, the friend they had lost, the genius they couldn't save, the man who should have been with them at the top of the world. Out of that grief came a simple riff. One day in the studio, David Gilmour strummed a few chords on his acoustic guitar. They were soft, circular, hypnotic, like a memory looping, refusing to let go. Roger Waters heard it, and something clicked. He began writing words full of questions, contradictions, aching doubt. So you think you can tell heaven from hell, blue skies from pain? On the surface, the lyrics sound like riddles, but underneath, they're drenched in sorrow. They're about seeing a world that looks real but feels fake, about being alive but not present, about longing for someone who's gone. And everyone in the band knew who those words were really for. Recording sessions at Abbey Road for the Wish You Were Here album were anything but smooth. The band was fractured, barely speaking, each man working in isolation. Sometimes entire days would pass with little progress. The silence in the studio was heavy, uncomfortable, almost suffocating, But when they played Wish You Were Here, something changed. For a few moments, they weren't fighting. They weren't lost in the machinery of fame. They were four men mourning a fifth. The song became their therapy, their confession, their attempt at reaching across the void to someone who was already slipping beyond their grasp. And then, Sid came back. It was June 1975. The band was deep into recording another track, Shine On You Crazy Diamond, a sprawling tribute written directly for Sid. That's when a strange man wandered into the studio. His head was shaved, his eyebrows gone, his body heavier. At first, no one recognized him, and then someone whispered, "It's Sid." The room froze. Roger Waters, usually cold and composed, broke into tears. David Gilmour stared, barely recognizing his childhood friend. Richard Wright could hardly play. They had been singing about him all day. Remember when you were young, you shone like the sun, and suddenly, there he was. But not the same, not the shining star they remembered. A shadow, a ghost in the flesh. Sid listened to the music quietly. When they asked him what he thought, he said it sounded a bit old. And then, as abruptly as he appeared, he left. That day was the last time any of them ever saw him. After that encounter, Wish You Were Here became something more. It was no longer just a song about longing. It was a farewell. The lyrics suddenly felt prophetic, as if they had been written for that exact moment. The refrain, how I wish you were here," carried an unbearable weight. Sid was alive, but unreachable. He was in the room, yet already gone. The band poured that grief into the track. Every strum of Gilmour's guitar, every weary note of Waters' voice was soaked in loss. And when the album was finally released later that year, the world heard the ache, even if they didn't know the story behind it. Yet the brilliance of Wish You Were Here is that it isn't just about one man. Yes, it was Sid's song, but it was also about the band themselves, trapped in fame, alienated from each other, questioning what was real and what was illusion. The line, "Did you exchange a walk-on part in the war for a lead role in a cage?" was Waters' bitter reflection on the price of success. Had they traded freedom for fame? Had they caged themselves in by chasing something that turned out hollow? The song became a mirror for the band, for Sid, and for anyone listening who had ever felt lost, disconnected, or longing for someone out of reach. When the album Wish You Were Here was released in September 1975, fans connected instantly. Many didn't know the hidden story of Syd Barrett, but they didn't need to. They felt the longing. They heard the sorrow. They recognized themselves in it. For some, it was about a lost love. For others, about death or absence. For many, it was about living in a world that felt increasingly unreal, and that's why Wish You Were Here spread so far, so fast. It wasn't just Pink Floyd's story anymore. It was everyone's. By the time Pink Floyd finished the album, they knew they had captured something raw, something unrepeatable. But they also knew the truth. Wish You Were Here wasn't a song of hope. It was a song of mourning. For Syd Barrett, for their own fading innocence, for the price of success. And as the world embraced it, singing along to its weary refrain, Pink Floyd carried a secret. The song wasn't just a hit. It was a goodbye they had never been able to say out loud. For Pink Floyd, finishing Wish You Were Here felt less like completing an album and more like closing a chapter of their lives. But the ghost of Syd Barrett never left the room. Every chord, every lyric was a reminder of the friend they had lost, not to death but to something harder to name. He was alive, yet unreachable, present in memory, but absent in reality. That kind of loss doesn't heal, it lingers. Roger Waters described it as mourning someone who was still walking the earth. David Gilmour called it one of the most painful paradoxes of his life, to know that Syd existed, but to also know the man he once loved as a friend was gone forever. That tension is what gives Wish You Were Here its power. It isn't mourning in the traditional sense, it's something stranger, grieving a man who was both alive and gone. After that shocking day in Abbey Road when Syd wandered in and out like a ghost, he disappeared into obscurity. He returned to Cambridge, living in his mother's modest home. He gave up music, gave up painting, gave up almost everything that had once defined him. Neighbors described him as quiet, sometimes irritable, sometimes distant. He would garden, take walks, or sit alone, rarely acknowledging his past. He never showed up to concerts, never contacted the band, never gave interviews. To the world, he became a myth, the fallen genius, the lost prophet of psychedelia. To his bandmates, he was simply a wound that would not close. But Wish You Were Here wasn't just about Sid, it was also about them. The band itself was unraveling under the weight of fame. The dark side of the moon had catapulted them into superstardom, but success brought disconnection. They were alienated from each other, from their audience, from the joy of making music. That's why the album begins with that eerie radio effect, as if you're hearing a performance from far away. It symbolizes the artificiality of the industry, the feeling of being trapped in a world that looks real but feels false. Then comes Gilmour's acoustic guitar, breaking through like a heartbeat, fragile but alive. The contrast says it all. Reality breaking through illusion, truth breaking through the noise. When listeners first heard Wish You Were Here, they didn't need the backstory. They didn't need to know about Sid, because everyone has someone they miss, and so the song took on lives of its own. It was played at funerals, sung at weddings, whispered through prison walls. Soldiers wrote its lyrics in letters home. Teenagers strummed it on battered guitars in their bedrooms, pouring their own heartbreak into the chords. Fans projected their own pain onto it. For some, it was about a friend who had drifted away. For others, a parent who had died too young. For others still, it was about the disillusionment of living in a world that felt fake. That's the genius of the song. It was born from one specific absence, but it became the soundtrack for every absence. The album Wish You Were Here was released in September 1975 and shot straight to #1 in both the UK and the US. It sold millions, cementing Pink Floyd as one of the biggest bands on earth. But there was a cruel irony. The album was about alienation, absence, and the emptiness of fame, and its success only intensified those very feelings. Roger Waters grew more bitter, channeling his anger into Animals and later The Wall. David Gilmour carried the guilt of being both Sid's friend and his replacement. Richard Wright felt increasingly marginalized. Nick Mason struggled to hold it all together. The song they had written as a farewell to a friend also became a warning to themselves. If they weren't careful, they too could disappear into alienation. On stage, Wish You Were Here became a ritual. The moment Gilmour strummed those opening chords, crowds would fall into silence. Thousands of people, strangers to each other, singing together, how I wish you were here." It was never just a performance, it was communion, an unspoken acknowledgement that everyone in that stadium carried some kind of absence inside them, and as the years passed, the song seemed to grow heavier, not lighter. The more times it was sung, the more loss it seemed to hold. Meanwhile, Sid lived on in Cambridge, largely untouched by fame. Stories of him became legend. Fans would occasionally spot him walking through town, overweight, bald, his eyes still distant. Some tried to talk to him, but he would brush them off, or ignore them entirely. He never tried to rejoin the band, never sought publicity. He seemed to exist in a parallel world, one that no one else could enter. For Pink Floyd, that silence was unbearable. They wanted closure, but Sid gave them none. And so the song became their closure, the only way to say goodbye to a man who would never respond. As decades passed, Wish You Were Here only grew in stature. It wasn't tied to one era, it belonged to everyone. In the 1980s, it became a quiet protest song for those disillusioned with politics. In the 1990s, it was adopted by grunge and alternative fans who saw themselves as outsiders in a fake world. After 9/11, it was played at vigils, a way of mourning not just lives lost, but the sense of safety that vanished with them, and today, it remains a staple of playlists for funerals, memorials, and late-night reflections. Its chords are simple enough to learn in an afternoon, yet heavy enough to carry a lifetime of grief. Syd Barrett passed away in 2006 from complications related to diabetes. He had lived almost 4 decades in silence, never returning to the stage, never breaking his self-imposed exile. When the news broke, fans worldwide turned to one song. They played Wish You Were Here. They sang it, cried to it, shared it as if the world had lost a family member. For Pink Floyd, it was devastating. They had written the song as a farewell, and now, finally, it was one. But it was also a cruel reminder. The real goodbye had been written 30 years earlier, in a studio filled with grief. Today, nearly 50 years after its release, Wish You Were Here is still one of the most beloved songs in rock history. It doesn't dazzle with technicality, it doesn't overwhelm with production, it simply speaks the truth. Because grief doesn't age, absence doesn't fade, and longing never loses its sting. That's why the song endures. Every generation discovers it anew, attaches their own loss to it, and sings along as if Pink Floyd wrote it just for them. So the next time you hear those opening chords drifting in like a faint signal breaking through static, remember, you're not just hearing music, you're hearing a band mourning a friend they could never save. You're hearing their guilt, their grief, their disillusionment with the very world they had fought to conquer. You're hearing the last message they could send to Syd Barrett, a man alive but already gone. And you're hearing yourself, because in the end, Wish You Were Here is about all of us. Every absence, every empty seat at the table, every name we whisper in the dark. That's why stadiums fall silent when the song begins. That's why fans around the world still strum it on old guitars, because we all have someone we wish was still here. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to Behind the Hit, because every great song carries a hidden history, and sometimes, the ones that sound the simplest hold the deepest truths.